Let me lead all of us into prayer. Our Lord, we want to thank you this evening for gathering us in this manner. We thank you for the world that you've created, a world that is studyable, a world that is observable, a world that is in many ways regular and conforms to how you have created order. So, Lord, as we commit to you the study of science and our observations of the world, we are, like the psalmist, in wonder at what you've created. May our reflections on the relationship between faith and science, between Christian faith and science this evening, as well as the conference to come, be acceptable in your sight. We pray that you will guide us, guide the speakers, guide us all with your spirit as we think about these matters. We pray that whatever we have thought of will be made use of to glorify you, as well as to speak of your goodness in each of our lives. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Hello, Faraday Singapore. It's a great honor and pleasure for me to be speaking to you. I'm in Austria. I'll just show you where I am. I'm on holiday. Just walk out so you can see the mountains, this beautiful part of the world, and then I'll start my talk. If you can see them in the background, there's a tree in the front, but you can see the magnificent Alps up there. And it's a very nice place to be, and it's a nice day to speak to you. So today the topic of I was given was to speak on the limits of science. And I want to give you some ideas about kind of what science can and can't do. So let me just share my screen with you. The limits of science. So as I'm sure you've been, I'm not sure if I was being introduced or not, but I'm Ard Louis, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the University of Oxford. I work mainly on biophysics with the interaction between biology and physics. It's a great privilege and honor to be able to do that and to actually get paid for it. It's amazing. And I have a little abstract of more or less what I wanted to say today. And it goes something like this. Science has brought us medicine, technology. It's given us unparalleled insights into the nature of our universe. You know, I have this, right now I'm speaking to you from Austria. I'm using my phone to connect to the internet, which is magically sending this talk right through to you in Singapore. Not that long ago, this would have seemed completely like a fantasy, but science, you know, we have medicine that has hugely improved our lives. And even in this time of coronavirus crisis, it's the science that we're looking really for a solution to the problem that's in front of us. So given this amazing track record, shouldn't we expect science and its powerful methods for gathering and organizing evidence also be privileged when we think about ultimate questions, and perhaps even the existence of God? Or is science, notwithstanding its power, poorly equipped to answer questions of meaning, value, and purpose? And if this is true, could there be other rational ways to weigh relevant evidence? So this is one of these kind of big questions that we have in life. And for myself, I started thinking, my first memory of what you might call a big question was when I was 7 years old. Oh, I forgot. I was going to tell you the outline. So I'm going to tell you what does science have limits, yes or no, and then I'm going to look a little bit at science from a Christian perspective. They're two tightly connected ideas. So back to my story, when I was 7 years old, we moved back to the Netherlands from Gabon, Central Africa, where I had lived in the jungle. We moved into a flat, probably very familiar to Singapore, but I'd never seen them before. We lived in one of these flats. And I remember one day, a 7-year-old walking outside, looking up and realizing that behind every single one of those windows was another family whose lives were rich and full and complicated like mine was. And I felt overwhelmed by the idea that there could be all of these different lives being lived at the same time. And it just seemed like something very, very big. Of course, not long after that school, I realized that, where I was living was just a small part of a very large planet called Earth, which itself was just part of a medium-sized of a solar system around a medium-sized star, our sun, one of many planets. And our sun is just one of many, many stars in its Milky Way galaxy. It has this kind of spiral shape. And if you look from the sides, we are over here in this side bit right here. And as you keep blowing up like this, if we start feeling more and more and more insignificant, and the size and the magnitude of this seems more and more and more amazing. And then later I realized when I went to university that pictures of the Milky Way were just one of a much larger set of galaxies in our universe. In this picture from the Hubble Deep Space Telescope, every dot in there is not a star, but a universe. We estimate that there are something on the order of 10 to the 22, 10 to the 23 stars in our universe. That's an unbelievably, unimaginably large number. And so if you look in the Psalms, thousands of years ago, the psalmist looked up at the heavens, saw the stars, and said, when I look at the stars, what is man that you are mindful of him? Last night up in the mountains with pure clean air, I saw way more stars than I ever usually see here in Europe. And I had this strong sense of the glory and grandeur of God and of my own finitude. And I think that's a very natural sense. And what these telescopes have really done is they just expanded that sense of wonder. Now, this also raises other kind of ultimate questions. And those are questions like, why is there something like a universe in the first place? Or perhaps a deeper one would be, why are there laws of nature? Just laws of nature are what we use loosely to describe the regularities that we see in our universe. Why is there something rather than nothing? In other words, why are there laws of physics that allow our universe to exist? And so this is where you can first kind of see that asking these big questions seems like a scientific question in the first part, and there's scientific aspects to it. So we understand that the laws of physics underlie our current universe, but where did those laws of physics come from in the first place is a kind of deep question. And then there are three possible options. So one is these laws of nature that we've discovered or are discovering have always existed. They're eternal in some way or the other. That's possible, but that seems strange because we have no experience or concept of things that have no beginning and therefore no origin, no cause. It's extremely strange. And so that's odd. The other possibility is that they popped into being out of ontological nothingness, which is a fancy way of saying true nothingness, so not just empty vacuum, but no laws of physics, no laws of mathematics, no laws of logic, just nothing. That's also possible, but again, strange. At least from a scientific point of view, it's not a scientific question. And the third option would be that all of space-time is dependent on some non-spatial temporal reality. So all of our laws of nature are dependent on some kind of reality that's outside of those laws of nature. And in traditional theism, this would be some kind of necessary being, a being who cannot not exist. Now, again, for a scientist, this is a somewhat unusual way of thinking about things, non-scientific. All three of these different options are non-scientific. Now, this doesn't mean that they're not interesting to think about, but they're fundamentally philosophical questions. And when we think about them and try to adjudicate between them, we might need to use slightly different methods than we might use in science to try to understand which of these three roughly is the right way. And you can probably think of different ways of thinking about it, but these are roughly the three options that are there for you. Either laws of nature existed or some previous set of laws calls them, and you've got some infinite regressive causes. You run into problems with causality, or they pop into being out of nothingness, which is strange, or you have to think of something outside of the laws of nature, which causes the laws of nature that we have. And the important point is that all three of these different things are fundamentally metaphysical, philosophical questions. I'm going to jump to a little piece of science that's been very dear to me. This is a very beautiful piece of science. I would say unbelievably beautiful. And let me try and explain that to you. So I realize not all of you are scientists, so I hope I can give you some sense of what I'm speaking about. So in the 1920s, Erwin Schrödinger came up with actually an Austrian from Austria, came up with the Schrodinger equation, which is, I've written a version of it down here, and it describes the theory of very, very small things like electrons. It's an extremely successful theory. It explains all kinds of things about the microscopic world. Actually, at that time, in 1905, Albert Einstein had come up with special relativity, which is a theory of very fast things. So here you see E is mc squared squared, right? Take the square root of it as mc squared. And here's a little momentum term, which takes into account that things that move as well. So E is mc squared is his famous formula. And he looked at what happens to things when they move at speeds close to the speed of light. And Paul Dirac in Cambridge was thinking about this not long after the Schrodinger equation. And he thought, well, what happens if you take something really small, it's governed by quantum mechanics, and make it move very fast, so it's also governed by the laws of special relativity. And it turns out that he tried to make the Schrodinger equation for electrons transform according to the laws of special relativity, and the only way he could make that work was to have not just the electron, which is these two bits here, up and down electron, but also some other object in his equations. And this is his famous Dirac equation that he wrote down in 1928. And it was, instead of having electron with up and down possibilities, which electrons can do, because they have a spin, it had this other object in there. And he later hypothesized, well, this must be some kind of particle that exists. And fascinatingly, a few years later, Carl Anderson at Caltech discovered this particle, and it's the positron. And what's amazing about the positron, it's the antimatter equivalent of the electron. So if the positron and electron come together, they annihilate, and the mass of the electron, the positron, becomes energy. E is mc squared are connected in this beautiful way. What's amazing about this is that Paul Dirac discovered antimatter just by thinking about it, just by making mathematical consistency between quantum mechanics and special relativity. And that's just an unbelievably beautiful thing. I remember as a physics student learning about this for the first time and just thinking, well, that cannot possibly be true. There is no way that these two theories, which are completely different from each other, when they come together, force on us something like antimatter. Maybe antimatter exists, but it shouldn't be forced on us in this way. I actually spent the whole night trying to prove Dirac wrong. It's the kind of hubris of youth. And of course, I had to realize that, this was the only way of doing it. In other words, what Dirac discovered was this whole other world of antimatter. And later, Eugene Wigner, a very, very famous, also Nobel Prize-winning theoretical physicist, wrote about these kinds of things and called them the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics, which is a gift we neither understand nor deserve. There's something almost magical about this ability of mathematics to allow us to peer much more deeply into the nature of the universe than we think we ought to be allowed to. I also think that this particular equation that Dirac came up with is unbelievably beautiful. It's as beautiful as the mountain ranges that I'm seeing around me here in Austria. And in fact, Henri Poincaré, another very famous mathematical physicist, wrote, "A scientist does not study nature because it's useful. He studies it because he delights in it. And he delights in it because it is beautiful. If nature were not beautiful, it would not be worth knowing. And if nature were not worth knowing, life would not be worth living." You can see he was a Frenchman. And the great British physicist and now theologian John Polkinghorne, who studied on Dirac, once asked him, "What's your fundamental belief?" And Dirac said, "My fundamental belief is that the laws of nature should be expressed in beautiful equations." So something very profound about this beauty that we see in the natural world. I made a little film documentary series, and here's a link down here, whyarewehere.tv, and in it we discuss this question of science and beauty and related questions like awe and wonder and sense of the sublime, which a lot of scientists experience when they look at the scientific world. And this raises questions: why are the laws of nature beautiful? Why is beauty something that leads to truth in some cases? These, I don't think, are actually scientific questions. They're meta-scientific questions, philosophical questions, super interesting, super important, but I think beyond the purview of science. And you'll see for a minute what I mean by that. So that's kind of a big question. And when I talk about science and faith, since we know science is a great way of obtaining reliable knowledge about the world, the science-faith debate is often one about whether science is the only way of getting reliable knowledge about the world, or whether there are other ways of getting reliable knowledge about the world. That's a super important question for everybody. And I think that's often where the science and religion debate can highlight some important aspects of this much bigger question. And I think most of these interrelations between science and faith are really more about theology and philosophy than they are about science itself. But it helps if you understand science, because it helps you kind of put a boundary on where science turns into philosophy. I've just given you an example now of the origin of everything. Why is there something rather than nothing, which I think is pretty clearly a philosophical question. And I've just shown you this question about beauty in science, which I think is probably a philosophical question, but maybe not. And these are kind of interesting things to think about. When do we have to use different methods of obtaining reliable knowledge? Now, what I've just told you, as if it's a fact, that thinking about the origin of the why there's something rather than nothing is a philosophical question, isn't actually shared by all of my scientific colleagues, particularly some of my colleagues who are popularizers. So here is Lawrence Krauss, a well-known popularizer of physics, who wrote a book a number of years ago called A Universe from Nothing, where he tried to explain where the laws of nature come from. On the back of it, it says, even my colleague Richard Dawkins says, even the last remaining trump card of a theologian, wise or something rather than nothing, shrivels up before your eyes as you read these pages. And he goes on to say that this book will be as important as The Origin of Species by Darwin. And Krauss is interesting because what he's actually popularizing in that book, although you have to think a little before you realize what he's saying, it's an idea not too different from the idea that Dirac had, that you could have electrons and positrons that come as pairs, energy turns into mass and vice versa. Krauss has an idea of this, that universes pop out of the quantum vacuum that there is. But he doesn't really, at the beginning, he actually says he doesn't want to talk about boring questions of philosophy. There's a bit of a controversy later in the Atlantic magazine, and Krauss wrote the following: philosophy is a field that unfortunately reminds me of that old Woody Allen joke. Those that can't do teach, and those that can't teach, teach Jim. Science progresses, and philosophy doesn't. Now, this book and these kinds of statements by Krauss got some pushback from the philosophers, as you might imagine. And there's a very interesting article in the New York Times by David Albert, who's a physicist and a philosopher, who basically says Krauss is dead wrong. And it's probably the most eviscerating review I've ever seen in the New York Times of somebody else's book. And Albert basically points out that the question of why there's something rather than nothing is not the question about why did a universe pop out of the laws of physics, because that's not the question. The question is, why are there laws of physics in the first place? It's an interesting question. If you've got laws of physics, can you make universes spontaneously emerge or not? But that's a scientific question. That's not the question that philosophers and theologians are talking about. They're talking about this much deeper philosophical question. Krauss called Albert moronic, and these popularizers of science like Lawrence Krauss or Richard Dawkins or others who speak disdainfully of philosophy is not that uncommon. The late Stephen Hawking wrote a book not so long ago, The Grand Design, New Answers to the Ultimate Questions of Life. And he basically says, how can we understand the world we find ourselves in? Did the universe need a creator? Why is there something rather than nothing? Why do we exist? These are great philosophical questions. It says, traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. Scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. So these are strong words. Here's one of the world's greatest scientists, one of the world's greatest popularizers of science, basically saying these big questions of why are we here, what is life about, why do we exist, are going to be answered by science and not by philosophy or by theology, for that matter. And actually, there's a word, I have a word for this which is used by others as well. This is called scientism, the idea that science can explain everything or will one day explain everything. And perhaps the most famous exponent of scientism, I think, was Carl Sagan. A little bit dated for the younger ones of you, but the older people remember him. He had this very, very famous and beautiful program called Cosmos, probably the first really big, giant, blockbuster series of popularizing science. And every episode began with Sagan saying the cosmos is all there ever is, or ever was, or ever will be. And he meant by the cosmos the physical universe. And this is a blatant kind of scientism. He's basically saying science is the only answer to everything. And if you read a bit more of Sagan, that's essentially what he believes. Here is a crisper and more detailed explanation of that by my Oxford colleague Peter Atkins. You can also see we interviewed him. He's very kind to be interviewed by us in Why Are We Here? So we have a long discussion with him on this. And he definitely hasn't mellowed in his ways, I should say, from when he wrote this 25 years ago. There is no reason to expect that science cannot deal with any aspect of existence. Although poets may aspire to understanding, their talents are more akin to entertaining self-deception. Philosophers too, I'm afraid, have contributed to the understanding of the universe little more than poets. I long for immortality, but I know that my only hope of achieving it is through science and medicine, not through sentiment and its subsets, art and theology. What Atkins is saying, if you look at some other ways to express this set of ideas, is that science is reliable. Science is what brought us things like technology of the telephone or medicine or the things that we can hold on to that's solid. Everything else is kind of fluffy. And so we should rely on science. Science is the only answer to the kind of questions that we'd like to, the only way of obtaining answers to questions that matter. Now, I want to contrast this with another great scientist from Oxford, Sir Peter Medawar, Nobel Prize winner in medicine, and also an atheist, actually. But he wrote a very lovely book shortly before he died, called The Limits of Science, in which he says that there is indeed a limit upon science is made very likely by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. These are the questions that children ask, the ultimate questions of Karl Popper. I have in mind such questions as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? It is not to science, therefore, but to metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion, we must turn for answers to questions having to do with first and last things. He then goes, contrast this with Atkins, by the way. He goes on a bit later to say, science is a great and glorious enterprise, the most successful, I argue, that human beings have ever engaged in. To reproach it for its inability to answer all the questions we should like to put to it is no more sensible than to reproach a railway locomotive for not flying, or in general, not performing any other operation for which it was not designed. So Medawar is saying basically, science is fantastic. He was obviously a very successful scientist, Nobel Prize winner, very dedicated to science, but that doesn't mean that it can answer all questions, and asking it to do so is mistaken. So what did he mean by why would it be mistaken? Well, let me give you an example of where it might be mistaken, I think even dangerous, to try to use science to answer a question that matters to all of us. What's the value of a human life? Now, we believe, I hope you believe, that humans have intrinsic value, and that their value doesn't depend on the color of their skin, or where they were born, or their wealth, or their clan, or all those other kinds of things, or their gender, all the kind of things or their intelligence. Humans' dignity and their value is intrinsic to them. Christians would say human beings have value because they were created and loved by God. People who are not Christians have other reasons, perhaps, for making the same argument. But the argument is extremely important, underlines a lot of the progress that we've made as communities, as social communities, as legal communities, as political communities. Now, how would you measure that? Well, I'll be facetious and say, what if you were a chemist? Would you measure the value of the elements? Well, surely somebody with gold fillings is not worth more than somebody without gold fillings. A physiologist, I'd measure the size of your brain, or a psychologist, how smart you are, or an anthropologist, how the community values you. Now, people have used all these metrics, in fact. An economist, how much economic value you produce. I sometimes worry that's how I am valued by my government. But fundamentally, we all sense that there's something wrong about using these kinds of metrics to try to value human beings differently. In fact, it's dangerous. Once you start trying to use these scientific techniques to measure something like intrinsic value of human beings, by taking that choice, you're immediately going in a direction that's going to give gradients between different people, and some people will have no value, and some people will have very high amounts of value, and that's wrong, or so many of us think. But the reason for that has nothing to do with science. The reason for that comes from other sources. And so there are many questions of this type that are super important, and that science may help us sharpen how we think about the questions, but it cannot answer these questions of value in and of itself. how something works is not the same as why it's there. Science can answer these how questions, but it cannot answer the ought questions. Now you might say, well, it feels a bit worrisome. If I let go of science, does that not mean that I'm somehow falling into irrationality? And here I have an analogy from a friend of mine, Bill Newsom, who's a very well-known neuroscientist at Stanford. And he told me one day he was walking across the Stanford campus where they have this beautiful memorial chapel, it's called. And his colleague said, oh, they should just blow that thing up. I don't like it. It's a monument to irrationality. To which Bill quipped back, well, in that case, we should blow up my house because it's also a monument to rationality. Well, that obviously got his colleague's attention. And Bill explained as follows. He said, and I'll generalize this. Let's say you want to get married. I'll generalize to myself. When I wanted to get married, you get to know somebody, and I got to know my wife, Mary. I knew her better. I was interested in what people that I trusted thought of us together, what they thought of her. I was interested in what her friends thought of her, what my friends thought of her. We did these compatibility tests, where you have to, like questions like where do you squeeze the toothpaste and what kind of music do you like and all that kind of stuff. And all that stuff is useful, and it all gives you, there's wisdom in the community, there's wisdom in using these kind of psychological tests to see how you'll be as a couple. But if I had waited for scientific certainty that Mary was the right person for me to marry, I think she would have gotten tired of it and moved on. Because you never know with scientific certainty that somebody's the right person to marry, because you don't know what it's like to be married until you've taken that step, right? It's a little bit like coming to faith in God. You don't know what it's like to really truly believe in God, be committed to God, until after you've taken that step. And the point is that there's evidence that I would never be able to see until I had committed to Mary. Just the same way if I say to Mary, I will only believe that you love me if I see evidence for it. Otherwise, I'm going to take the assumption of scientific skepticism until I see evidence. Well, there's a lot of evidence I would never see. Instead, I need to commit to loving her, and then the love will become revealed if it's there. And so what this tells you is that many important decisions in life are not amenable to scientific question. It's not a good idea to do repeatable experiments in marriage, because there's aspects of real life that are only accessible to us in different ways. And I would say many important parts of life have that character to them. Science may help you. There's psychological tests. Science can help you work them out, make them better, but they're not the same as knowing for sure what it's going to be like when you're married. You don't know until you are. So that's a simple example, almost trivial example, of where science cannot and will not and should not answer really important questions of life. And if you try to use scientific methods to find somebody to marry, you'll probably be pretty frustrated, because it's not how the world works. It's not how life is. It's just not the way our world has been put together. To summarize this bit of my talk about the limits of science, I'd say, well, we think about this big question of science and God and the human condition. What does it mean to be human? How do we decide what's good and what's right or bad? What's right way to live our lives? Science is like a very bright light. It shines very brightly in certain directions, like in directions of technology, in directions of medicine, typically in the direction of repeatable things, or sometimes in historical sciences and things that happened in the past. It's very bright. It would be wonderful if that brightness could be shining everywhere, and we could use it to understand the value of human beings, what it means to live a moral life, etc. But it doesn't. And its great success comes precisely from limiting itself to those things that are there under the light, as it were. The great philosopher Alvin Plantinga is the one that gave me this analogy, and he talks about it also in a slightly different way. He says, for some people, the argument that only science can bring true knowledge, scientism, so the idea from that Atkins or Krauss or Sagan or Dawkins or many are pushing forward on us, is like the drunk who insists on looking for his lost car keys only under the streetlights on the grounds that the light was better there. In fact, it would get the drunk one better. It would be to insist that because the keys could be hard to find in the dark, they must be under the lights. In other words, if you think that science, which is a very bright light, is the only way of understanding the world, then what you're going to start saying is that any questions that are out there a bit harder to access, are therefore unimportant. And that's a very strange and weird way of living. And I don't think even those people that profess scientism actually live their lives in that way, because it's an impossible way to live your life. Let me give you one or two more examples of how this can be unpacked sometimes. So let's say you come into my home and you ask me, why is the water boiling? And I say, the water is boiling because there's a thermal heat source that transfers energy across the container wall into the liquid. That increases the mean square velocity of the water molecules. That mean square velocity is directly proportional to something we call temperature. When temperature reaches 100 degrees Celsius, then there is a phase transition from a condensed phase to expanded phase, which we call boiling, and that's why the water is boiling. Now, what scientism sometimes tells you is that that explanation is the full exhaustive, that's the profound, deep explanation for why the water is boiling. If you're taking my thermodynamics exam, that would be a suitable answer to this question. But you could also come in and ask me, why is the water boiling? And I could say to you, well, look, I fancy a cup of tea. Would you like one? And that's a perfectly legitimate answer as well to the same question. And one really important point that scientism often gets wrong is that it misses the fact that there are many layers of meaning to even a question like why the water is boiling. And you have to be careful when you're using the method of science that you don't become myopic and only focus on one kind of question, not the other. Otherwise, you'll miss my cup of tea. Another kind of example of this is what we might call nothing buttery. Now, here's a really good example of nothing buttery by Francis Crick, great Nobel Prize winner, just helped discover DNA together with Watson and Crick. He wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis, where he says, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. What he's saying is, your memories, everything that makes you you, is the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells, and it's nothing but that. We might call that nothing buttery, where I explain something scientifically, maybe something very beautiful and profound and deep about how the neurons work, and then I tell you that I've explained it all away, nothing but these. Well, I'll make another slightly facetious example to hopefully show you why this is a silly way of thinking about it, even if it's packed in beautiful language and written by a very brilliant scientist. So, for example, I am a collection. I'll give you a romantic example. So let's say you are a young man and you're trying to impress a young woman, and you've got a nice table by the water, there's a rose on the table, there's beautiful food, everything is perfect, and things are going very, very well. And at some point, she leans across the table and asks you, so, do you really know who I am, what I'm made of? And of course, you know this is an important question, you don't want to get it wrong, and so you panic. Don't worry, that happens all the time. What you shouldn't do in that case is to think to yourself, well, I know what you're made of. You're made of chemicals. I just learned that at school. You're made of 60% water, probably enough phosphorus for 10 matches, 20,000 matches, enough iron for one nail, enough chlorine to disinfect a swimming pool, and if you're like an average human, probably enough fat to make 10 bars of soap. At this point, you might get a slap. Even if you say 1 bar of soap, you might get a slap. Because of course, it's true that what your love interest is made of is a collection of chemicals, but when she asked you, who am I, what do you think I'm really made of, that's not what she's asking, clearly. But it's true that she's nothing but. She's true that she's made of chemicals, but she is not nothing but chemicals. And this is probably why you get the slap, besides the fact that you're mentioning the fat, which is never a good idea. So if I think this question, who am I, you'll see I can answer this question in many, many different ways. And just give you another kind of illustration of this, who am I? Well, I'm many different things. I'm a self-assembled biological machine. I am the product of my genes. I am the product of an evolutionary process. I'm the member of a social system. I'm gendered. I'm a citizen. I'm an economic actor. I'm a father. I'm many different things. I'm also an animal. In fact, I can show you what kind of animal I am. I'm from the kingdom Animalia, the phylum Chordata, class Mammalia, the primates, the order, the family, tribe, subtribe, genus, species, Homo sapiens. And this is a really nice way of describing who I am. I am an animal, Homo sapiens. I look around me, I see lots of other animals, different species, sometimes even different phyla. This is true. I can also ask this question in a very different way. So for me, as a Christian, I would say, well, who am I? Well, the place where I find the answer to that question is in the Bible. And so it tells me a lot of different things. It tells me I am a child of God, which means I am created by God and in his image. I'm loved by God. I'm a new creation in Christ. For the Reformed theologians in the audience, I am predestined to be adopted into sonship. So sonship is a kind of sense of being part of the family of God. I'm part of the body of Christ. And it says here, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. These are very wonderful words about who we are. And then there's some reason for this, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. So these are a whole series of things of who I am, of what I am actually made for. So that was the first part of my talk. Does science have limits? And I hope that I've explained to you that I think it's not actually a controversial question at all. Yes, of course it has incredibly strong limits. That's part of its power. The question of how you should adjudicate the things outside of its limits, like what does it mean to be a human being? What's the value of a human being? What is a good life? Those are much more complicated questions that I've only just briefly touched on. I want to segue to a related question, which is how, as a Christian, do I think about the science that I do in the day-to-day life? What is it that I'm actually doing in the laboratory from day to day, or in my case, on the computer or with a pen and paper as a theorist? Well, then, again, I go to the Bible and say, what does the Bible tell me about the natural world? Now, the Bible doesn't tell me very much about science. The Bible was written in a pre-scientific time where this is not a question that people worried about. But it does tell me a lot about God who created the worlds. It tells me in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It also tells me more than just the fact that God created the world at the beginning, as it were, but that God is continually involved in creation. So we see in this fabulous Christological passage in Colossians 1, for by Christ, all things were created, and in him all things hold together. So not only were they created in the past, but currently they all hold together. In a kind of parallel Christological passage in Hebrews 1, we see the Son is the radiance of God's glory, sustaining all things by his powerful word. With the last book of the Bible, Revelations, you are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they existed and were created. So this is telling us something very profound. Not only does God create the world, but he sustains the world. God is continuously sustaining the world. The doctrine of creation is not primarily about beginnings. It's primarily about relationship between God and matter and the world that he created. And so this is something really important. We should think this through for what this means for science. Historically, it had a really important impact on the birth of modern science. When we say that God sustains the world, what we really mean is not that, what we don't mean is that, God every so often pokes into the world and makes sure it's working well. It means if God were to stop sustaining the world, it wouldn't just grind to a halt. It means if God were to stop sustaining the world, it would stop existing. Right? So God is continuously sustaining the world. When we study science, we're really studying the customs of the creator, the ordinary way that God sustains the world. You see, it's already back in the 17th century. So John Donne writes, an act of God is so marvelous that only the daily doing takes off the admiration. And when we, as Christians, think about God's action in the world, we typically think about miracles. So we often, without realizing it, take on a kind of semi-deistic point of view where the world's running on its own and God occasionally pokes in and does something. And so we might say in church, oh, God was truly present today because something miraculous happened, as if God is not present all the time. It's just it's not a biblical concept. And in fact, if you look in the Bible when it describes miracles, so say, Jesus walking on water, Jesus turning water into wine, or more profoundly, Jesus raising from the dead. The language of miracle is always used together with a word, so the word teras, which means something like wonder, is always used together with the word dunamis, work of power, or a semeion, a sign. So these wonders, that you might call them miracles, are always happening for God's redemptive purposes, very specific reasons that God has and they can be signs or works of power. They're never done as kind of magic things up in the sky to amaze us. That's super important. Obviously, if God created the world and God is sustaining the world, then God can occasionally sustain the world in an uncustomary way, like turning water into wine at the wedding of Cana or walking on water. That's if you created God. It's not if you created the world, so it's not so surprising that you can do that. Right? There's nothing surprising about that. Once you have the premise that God created the world, the subsequent possibility of sustaining the world in a slightly different way is not that surprising. So when we're doing science, we're not studying miracles because we don't have access to the special divine purposes of God. So much so that if somebody were to come, so in other words, we study the regular ways that God sustains the world. So we're studying something about the regular way that God has put this world into place. And if one of my students comes to me and says, a miracle occurs in the lab, come and look at it, I would say, well, on Christian grounds, on theological grounds, I do not believe that's true, because I can't think of any reason why God would do this miracle in some kind of repeated way in experiment. That's not how God appears to work. So when I'm doing science, I think I am, in the words of Johannes Kepler, famous discoverer of the orbits of the planets, thinking God's thoughts after him. And that's what science effectively is. Science is understanding the regular ways that God sustains the world. And I think for Christians who are in the sciences, this is very important and freeing, because it tells us that the more we learn about the way the world works, the more we can praise God who put this world together, and not only put it together, but actually continuously sustains it. The laws of nature are not somehow laws telling the world what to do. They're the descriptions of how the world works. And how the world works is something that God is constantly involved in. Another historical example that kind of illustrates this a little bit is from a very famous argument between Isaac Newton and his contemporary Leibniz. It's actually the Leibniz Clark lectures, but it was almost certainly Newton who was writing this. And so they had some back and forth. They were big rivals. And Newton, of course, discovered the laws of gravity, which explained Kepler's elliptical orbits. But there's a problem with that, right? So the sun orbits in this beautiful elliptical orbit around the Earth in a beautiful elliptical orbit around the sun. The sun is Jupiter, right? So Jupiter therefore also pulls on the Earth, as is Mercury, Venus, Mars, Saturn. They're all pulling on the Earth. And once you think about that, you realize that actually this orbit is going to become unstable at some point because it's getting pulled in lots of different directions, and the Earth will get ejected from the solar system, which would be bad for all of us. So Newton thought perhaps God occasionally sends a comet through to kind of reform the planets, to stick them back to their original, nice, safe elliptical orbits. And Leibniz wrote back and objected on two grounds. The first was, if God had to remedy the defects in his creation, then this surely demeans his craftsmanship, right? If you didn't get it right in the first place, then that's not wrong. That's a kind of an aesthetic argument. And the second, I think, more profound argument that Leibniz wrote is, I hold that when God works miracles, he does not do it in order to supply the wants of nature, but those of grace. Whoever thinks otherwise must needs have a very mean notion of the wisdom and power of God. In other words, what Leibniz is expressing here is the same thing I explained to you just 2 slides ago, or 3 slides ago, which is that God does miracles for his divine, not because of needs of nature, but because of his own divine purposes, because of grace. And it would seem strange that God would not set the planets upright and have to fix it every so often. That's a low view of God. And I think that's a very profound and deep and important argument that helps us think about how this works. Now, interestingly, the history of this story of why the planets are stable goes on for a long time. So Pierre-Simon Laplace, the famous French mathematician, wrote a 5-volume essay on the planets, which he presented to Napoleon, and apocryphally it's said that Napoleon asked him why he didn't mention God in this book. And the book Laplace actually claims to solve the problem of the stability of the planets. And the argument is the claim is that Laplace answered back and said, "Sir, I have no need for this hypothesis." It's unlikely that's exactly what happened, but it's a good story. And it's often told along the lines of, we used to think that we needed God to keep everything together, but now we realize that we can explain it on its own. In reality, it was only much more recently, in the last 30, 40 years, and maybe even more recently, that we've understood the stability of the planets. Laplace was actually wrong. When he went to higher orders in his calculations, the planets become unstable again. And it's only with our understanding of chaotic orbits and then islands of stability inside chaotic orbits, the ability to do very long computer simulations, that has allowed us to explain why our solar system is stable. Now imagine that you were a Newtonian and you believe that the instability of the planets was proof of God because God had to occasionally intervene to fix it. So you didn't take the Leibniz's view, but you took this, I think, slightly lower view. Then you would have been fine until quite recently, when suddenly that interpretation of Christianity would have been shot down. And thinking that God kind of works in this kind of way of fixing nature is what we sometimes call God of the gaps. So there's a gap in our understanding, gap in Newton's understanding of why the planets were stable, and so he posited God in there. Here you see this famous little quote, some calculations, then a miracle occurs, some further calculations. And he says, I should be a bit explicit here at step 2. And that's essentially what Newton was doing, and Leibniz called him on it on the basis that this was not a good way of thinking about God. This demeaned God's craftsmanship and also didn't have a good understanding of God's work in salvation history. And so that idea of God of the gaps has been repeated by many other theologians. Perhaps the most famous popularizer of this was Charles Coulson, the first Oxford professor of theochemistry and also a Methodist lay minister, very deep thinker actually on science and faith. He wrote on this, the idea of God of the gaps, and this is a fatal step to take, for it is to assert that you can plant some sort of hedge in the country of the mind to mark the boundary where a transfer of authority takes place between God and nature. Either God is in the whole of nature with no gaps, or is not there at all. And this is really important because it tells us that when we do study science, we're studying the regular ways that God sustains the world. In fact, if we believe in God, then we have some good arguments for some surprising things about our world, like that the world is regular, that it's uniform, which basically means if I do experiments in Oxford and somebody in Cambridge, under the same conditions, at least if they're smart, should get the same results. Well, that's not at all what most people through history have felt or thought about nature. Nature, when you're in the outdoors, feels capricious. This is our ideas that came from a theological understanding of the types I've just explained to you, of a God of behind the world, a God of faithfulness behind the world, who sustains the world in a regular way. Once you realize that, then you can start looking for those laws and seeing whether it's possible to understand them. If you don't believe in God, then you can posit as a kind of root fact that the world is regular or that the world is repeatable or intelligible, but you don't have a fundamental, you may not have a fundamental, deeper reason for that. Whereas once you posit the idea of a God, a creator behind the world, it's not that surprising that you might find something like regularity or intelligibility in our universe. And so I think in this way, a Christian way of understanding science actually is a very deep way of understanding some of the metaphysical underpinnings of why science works. And it's important for Christians also to therefore be free to study science and follow it as far as it goes, and not to be afraid that somehow at some point this is going to undermine our faith. At the same time, it's also important to remember that there are many questions in science that science cannot answer, and for which other ways of knowing that could be irrational, but ideally are rational. I gave the example of getting married. There are irrational ways of doing it, like grab the first person you see and say, marry me. If they say yes, it's even more irrational and slightly worrying. But the rational ways of doing it, we should do in community, but they're not fundamentally scientific ways. There are other ways of knowing. And you can think of many levels and gradations of this question. It's actually a much more interesting question than the ones I've covered on the limits of science, much more complicated, much more difficult, but it's not the topic of the day. In summary then, I asked the question, does science have limits? And I think the answer is yes. I think this is uncontroversial. It cannot answer questions of meaning, value, and purpose. It cannot take you from an is to an ought. It just cannot do that. And so therefore, it doesn't mean that it can't help you understand questions of meaning, value, and purpose better by measuring things, by understanding how pain works, how it can be mitigated, all kinds of things is important, but it doesn't tell you what is right or what is wrong. That's really simple. Lots of these questions have to come from other sources. And as a community, as a society, as individuals, we need to think about what those sources are and where they come from. Everybody who's watching this has some kind of theory for where their where value comes from, where it's right, what's wrong, how they should live their lives, because they're living their lives in a particular way. And the only question really is where does that come from? Well, science is not the place that comes from. It must come from somewhere else. It could be your religious community, it could be a book like the Bible, it could be just what you absorb from the environment around you, from television, from your friends. But something is telling you where the answers to those questions are coming from. And then I think scientism, the idea that science is going to answer all questions or is the only really proper way of answering all the ultimate questions, even though I think it's, fundamentally, fatally flawed, it's in fact self-referentially incoherent. The idea of scientism is itself a non-scientific statement, it's a philosophical statement. Unfortunately, it's rife in popular accounts of science. So many popularizers of science slip in all kinds of scientism. Watch many programs that popularizing science, and you'll see that kind of slipped in. Look at great popularizers like Richard Dawkins or Lawrence Krauss or Carl Sagan or Neil deGrasse Tyson, or go on and on and on. Great popularizers, but they also believe in a kind of scientism, and it slips in all the time. And one of the ways they do that is by conflating mechanism and meaning, by saying, giving a beautiful explanation of mechanism, and suggesting that somehow this exhausts all the meaning of that thing that they're describing. Or using some version of nothing buttery. I've explained something to you, it's nothing but this. Your brain is the sum of a bunch of neurons, it's nothing but the sum of a bunch of neurons. And the last thing I looked at very briefly was science from a Christian perspective. I looked at the doctrine of creation, the idea that God not only created the world, but sustains the world today, and that this therefore means that when we're studying science, we're studying the customs of the Creator, the ordinary, regular way that God sustains the world. And I pointed out that Christians, for this very theological reason, shouldn't fall prey to simplistic arguments like God on the gaps, like trying to find God in the bits that we don't understand. No, God is there in everything. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, and I think I'll be taking some questions very soon. Thank you.
Let me introduce to you also Professor Russell Coburn, who's a professor of experimental physics at the University of Cambridge, with research interests in nanotech and its application to magnetism, electronics, and optics. He will be speaking with us tomorrow. So in case you're interested, that's what we'll be hearing about from Professor Coburn. And of course, you've already seen and listened to the video that was recorded for us with a video that makes us all very jealous for the Austrian mountains. Us stuck in Singapore in very hot weather. But Professor Art Louis is also joining us. I assume you're still in Austria right now, and he's the Professor of Theoretical Physics at the University of Oxford, where he leads an interdisciplinary research group studying problems on the border between chemistry, physics, and biology. Thank you for joining us, Prof. Thank you so much for being with us. First off, let me just ask Bob if you could tell us a little bit about the Faraday Institute.
Right, yes, I'm unmuted now so you can see me. Yeah, the Faraday Institute was founded in 2006 by a colleague of mine, Dennis Alexander, who's a biological scientist, and myself, who's a physical scientist. And our main objective really was to reach our tribes of scientists with the concept that you don't have to throw away your brain to be a believing Christian, as well as a good scientist. So we're an institute which now has about 19 staff in it, dedicated to understanding science and religion interactions, but with a particular emphasis on Christianity, so science and Christian faith. And we do that through a number of ways, through research into some of the big questions, through outreach to church communities, to schools and youth, and to the general public, and by giving talks and so on. We have a great website, which if you Google Faraday Institute, you'll find it. And that has got about, I think it's now 700 recorded videos of lectures and seminars. So it's a great resource. If you want to dig into any subject to do with science and religion, you'll find probably somebody has given a talk on it. It also has brief summaries of some of the main Concepts in Science Religion called Faraday Papers bookshop, and all sorts of other material as well. There's a good church section, a good schools and youth section as well. So I see that you've put around the website in the chat line. So do look at that. It's a great resource, and that's what we're about, really. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. That's faraday.cam.ac.uk for those of you who can't see the text in Zoom chat. Faraday.cam.ac.uk. Next, I'd like to just pose this question, and I'm going to pose it at all three of you. And as usual, when we have a panel, this is a softball, as the Americans call it. This is not a difficult question. This is something for us to know a little bit about you. So maybe I can ask this of our speaker for this evening at first, Ard. We heard a little bit about this, but could you tell us a little bit about how did you get into science as a calling? Just a little bit about that, if you would.
Unmute me. So hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I just want to check you can hear me, and
Yes.
just show you where I am. This is my view as I'm speaking to you. Can you see that?
Yes.
So I've always loved nature. And I've been very fortunate to grow up in Gabon in Central Africa, which is a jungle, but also extremely beautiful nature. And I think it's natural if you're out looking at the nature that you're interested in science. My parents were biologists, and so for my earliest memories are of loving the world and thinking about it. In my teens, I got very interested in physics, and I more or less felt a calling to physics from that time. And that's more or less it. So I've wanted to do physics since I've known I wanted to do physics since I was probably 14 or 15. And it's mainly been because I loved it from the moment I started doing it, and I still love it. I can't believe that somebody pays me money to think about it all day long.
Thanks, Art. What a brilliant description. And when I was 14, I was thinking of how to get out of physics, but we have our own crosses to bear.
I always tell people that I work on it. I worry about it, so you don't have to.
Thank you. Let me pose the same question to Professor Russell Coburn. How did you get into science as a calling? Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. I think it was in my DNA from birth. Even at the age of 3 or 4, I was disassembling things and building circuits. My father taught me how to make an electrical switch about the age of 5 or 6, and there was no stopping me from there. And then obviously, as I went through more formal education, I discovered physics. And I think it was as Ard was saying about the self-consistency and the way that Dirac was able to predict the existence of the positron. I mean, obviously at school level physics, I was never doing anything that advanced, but I still got a sense of that. I could tell that within the structure and the order of relatively simple axioms of physics, you had the elements of everything, essentially. And I found that enormously attractive. And I absolutely understand your point about getting out of physics. It's my experience at a drinks party if somebody says, "What do you do?" and I say, "I'm a physicist," that there's no surer way of shutting down the conversation. But I think actually to those people who can do physics, it is actually really easy. You know, there isn't the large volumes of things to learn that there are in, say, the biological sciences. To me, physics is very, very streamlined. It's very elegant, and I think that's always what's attracted me to it.
Thank you, Russell. Maybe I can agree with this experience. Whenever I go to a drinks party or anywhere else, and people ask me what I do, and I say I teach the Bible. I teach in a theological institution, and quiet. I have to move on to the next subject. Nobody wants to talk to me after that. Thanks. Maybe I'll pose now the same question to Bob White, and could you tell us a little bit about how did you get into science as a calling?
Yeah, it's very similar to to my two colleagues. When I was young, I just used to make things. I remember making a crystal radio. I made a little motor. It used a lot of mercury, I remember, which you'd probably never be allowed to do now. Little motor that went round with a mercury for the contact, and wind my own armatures and so on, which was great. And I think that's probably something the modern youth miss out on, actually, is just building things, building out of cardboard and building rockets, with fireworks in them to try and make them take off, that sort of thing. So I went up to Cambridge to study physics. Unlike my two colleagues here, who are both physicists, turned out I found it quite difficult. But in Cambridge, you have to do other subjects as well as your main one, and one of those was geology, and I just loved that because like art, I just like the outdoors, and geologists are always going on field trips and camping and such like. So I went into geology, did a degree in geology, but actually then I ended up, as you've said at the beginning, doing geophysics. So I do still do some physics, but physics of the earth. And again, like art, I just think it's a huge privilege to have been able to spend a professional career studying God's creation very directly, the rocks that you see in front of you there. And that has been a great career. And it's something that I just love to share with other people. And as I say, also, as I said at the beginning, studying God's creation makes you really appreciate the Creator. It seems to me there's nothing you could learn from science that would make you disbelieve the existence of God. I mean, how could it when He made it?
Thank you, Bob. That's a really interesting comment. Maybe I should, kind of move into kind of if we could talk about some of the challenges that you faced. I mean, all three of you, you're Christians. You're doing research, writing papers, doing doing physics so that others don't have to do it, as you put it. Were there any times in your career as a professional scientist, as a researcher, were there any challenges that you faced either as a Christian or in doing this, or challenges to your faith? Is there anything that you might want to share about? And I leave this open if anyone wants to chime in on that. Any particular thing that just, oh gosh, this is interesting. I need to sort this out. Yeah.
Shall I chip in?
Yeah, please.
I think one of the hardest things, actually, it's not anything you might do in your science, because, as I say, how could that possibly point to anything but a creator God if you're studying His creation? I think one of the difficulties with being an academic is that it can become all-consuming, and we have to keep things in balance because we're called to serve God through our whole lives. Not just in doing science. And I think a great many scientists give their whole meaning is in their science. So that's something probably that any professional in any profession has to be careful about. Otherwise you start neglecting your family and your church fellowship and so on. So keeping things in balance when you're working in a community where other people are completely committed to it. So I try never to work on Sundays, for example. And I get really cross when people start scientific conferences on Sundays. And that's something that non-believers don't understand, I guess. The other aspect, I think, about some academics is that I could tell you my citation indexes and who's quoted me and, my ranking in this and that and the other. And now there's a great seduction, I think, to try and push yourself forward at the expense of others, if you like. Now, of course, that's not necessary to being an academic. It's just the milieu in which you work that everybody sort of ranks themselves. And I think for a Christian, you have to stand up against that, and to stand against something when it's in your very culture is harder. So I think that is something that you have to do. I don't know what my colleagues would think, whether they've experienced any of that. So that's my perspective.
You wanna, either of you want to take that question?
I could say a thing or two. Actually, go on, Art. Do you want to speak? You haven't had a bite of the cherry yet.
Oh, I was just going to say I very much agree with Bob's assessment of
some of the struggles are the same struggles you have in many professional careers, because people define themselves by their work, and that affects all kinds of things which Christians probably wouldn't do, or shouldn't do. Having said that, I think actually being part of a community, not working on Sunday, for example, or taking some kind of Sabbath or rest, is something that will, in the end, make your research better, I think. I recommend it to my students who are not Christians to take some time off, because when I think they're working too hard, because it kind of refreshes your mind, gives you new, fresh ideas. I think another kind of struggle that I've had in the science is that it has not to do with the science, but with the kind of social structure around it and the way people think. People are often very secular in their thinking and their talking and their speaking, and if you're not careful and you're in that all day long, you can kind of imbibe it. It can become part of you, and it's important, therefore, to spend some time outside of the lab with other Christians, for example, to just kind of recalibrate your sense of reality. And it can be as simple as in the lab every day you're doing the same kinds of things, which are very ordered, very structured, very logic oriented. It is tempting to think that other aspects of life will also somehow be treated that way. And I've got colleagues who kind of try to live their private lives that way. It doesn't tend to work very well, but it's a temptation that we can be, I think, sometimes pulled into. So I think the struggles for Christians in the sciences are not really fundamentally with the topics of what they study, but it can be with the environment that they're in. So either the competition, sometimes the unpleasantness, and the kind of the sense of secular sense that there is. And if you're not careful, you can get sucked into that kind of a world. Just like the party culture can be very seductive to teenagers, a similar kind of thing can be seductive to scientists who want to be liked, who want to be part of the kind of cool people. There's nothing different in those issues than there is in many, many other fields of work. And so it's helpful for us all to kind of learn from one another in that sense.
Maybe I could just add a couple of things. I agree entirely with that my story was slightly special in as much as I became a Christian almost at the very same moment that I was starting my university education of physics. So I became a Christian at the age of 18 during a gap year before going to Cambridge to be an undergraduate. So I've sort of been living this question of science and Christianity my entire life. And I think when I first arrived in Cambridge to study physics, I did ask one or two older and wiser colleagues, I've just become a Christian and I'm just becoming a physicist. Am I going to have a problem? And I hear things and I understand there's some incompatibility. Am I going to find myself in big trouble? And at the time, those friends said, don't worry, we sorted all of this out in the 19th century. There's nothing fundamental to worry about. And so I thought, great, and just got on with doing both. And I was very happy just doing both until probably 15 years ago, with the rise of the new atheists and people like Professor Dawkins saying that it was fundamentally impossible to hold a position of faith and to be a scientist. And I had to then revisit the question and actually start reading for myself and learning all those things that had been discussed in the past. And having been through that loop, I then realized that I was right all along and that there isn't a fundamental problem. But I guess it took a bit of pressure from the outside to make me learn those things for myself. I guess the thing we haven't touched on, which I haven't experienced hugely, but which does happen from time to time, is meeting fellow Christians at church who are hostile to science. We know about the hostility the other way. We know about atheist scientists who are hostile towards people of faith, but there is a small cluster of people of faith who are hostile towards science and therefore scientists. And on a very small number of occasions, it was clear they treated me with a degree of suspicion as somebody who had either sold out or was working for the enemy. And that's very sad when you have brothers and sisters in Christ who can't understand your mindset.
Thank you. All three of you, those are very interesting and insightful answers. I know that in our audience, those who are listening in either on Zoom or YouTube, there are number of people who are either undergraduates studying science now, or they are professional scientists, researchers. So I think your life stories, it's a little bit of an aspect of that's helpful for all of us to hear that. I'd like now to, as a transition to the questions that have been coming in. Thank you for that. Maybe just one more question from me, and then we'll go into the questions. I'll show my Slido screen to see what are the questions that have been upvoted, and we'll try to tackle them, the most popular questions from our participants tonight. So that question that I want to ask before we go into the Slido is something that occurred to me as we were talking about the limits of science, or as Art was talking about it, and that it seems to me that the present climate is a strange mixture of putting science on a pedestal. Kind of science has disproved God. We have no need for that hypothesis, that great apocryphal story that Art told. And then, so scientism, as it were, and then now in our present climate, a distrust of experts. Do you have any comment about that? Kind of, sciences answers our questions, and then it looks like with coronavirus, with what's, I don't know, popular kind of media going on in America as well as in the West about this distrust of experts. We have no needs for experts. So do you have any thoughts about that? And if you have, there's a couple of lines, and then we'll go into the Slido questions. Anyone wants to feel that?
Let me just give one thought, which is, I think there are a small number of very vocal scientists who go by the ideas of scientism, as Ard was talking about, that think science is the only answer. And they start talking way outside their area of expertise. I mean, just because they're good at quantum mechanics doesn't mean to say they're good at interpersonal relationships, for example. And I think that's a danger, actually, that it's trusting science in the areas where science is valid and has something to say is obviously a good thing to do. But scientists have no particular remit to talk outside of that. And we kind of, because science is so powerful, we put them on a pedestal, and then we kind of think they have the answers to everything. And clearly, as we just heard in that talk, that just common sense tells you that's not the case. So I think that's been one of the issues. The other thing I might say about in the current COVID-19 pandemic is that those countries who have leaders who have largely ignored scientists actually have deaths on their hands, many thousands of deaths on their hands, I would say. And so I think that there is an issue here that if you do avoid scientific truth, there are consequences. And in the current climate, it is tens of thousands of people dying. It's a bit of a sober thought, so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bob. What about Russell and Ard? Any comments that you want to make?
I mean, I very much agree with Bob's comment about the limits of individual scientists. And I think, to be honest, you have to be in the business to really know this. From the outside, it is often assumed that scientists know everything. And if a particular scientist says there is no God, then everybody says, oh, well, he or she has studied an awful lot, that must be the case. But as soon as you actually meet these people and work with them and know them intimately, you realize that we are all alike, and that we have one thing that we do really well. And in everything else, we are no better than a well-informed amateur. So I think being inside the system allows you to see through people a little bit more, and to realize that maybe they don't have the authority to speak outside of their own speciality that others assume they might. And I mean, it may be, I think it's too soon to tell, but it may be that COVID, in God's providence, is one of the mechanisms by which expertise and knowledge is brought back into fashion. Because it is clear that if you want a vaccine to COVID, then you've got to have some people who understand immunology. And it's, generally scientists are quite useful.
Thank you, Russell. Ard, anything to add?
No, I thank you. I think that Russell and Bob more or less covered it. My only thought would be on your first part of the question, which is the distrust of expertise, I mean, that's as many complicated reasons, and we'll over time study it and maybe get a better sense. There's moves towards populism. I do think there is a sense in which sometimes people use science or scientists to further other agendas, and often just ordinary people with common sense can feel that, they sense it, and so they get nervous about it. And unfortunately, one of the things it does is it leads to a distrust of expertise, which can then have, as Bob pointed out, really negative consequences when you're facing a disease, for example, where expertise is absolutely paramount. So I think it's a very complicated question of why exactly this happened and why it happened at this time. But surely one contributing factor has been, people in power, elites using wrapping themselves in the mantle of science and pronouncing on various things in ways that were just wrong. And of course, if you're an outsider to this, if you're an insider, you're used to scientists trying things out, sometimes pontificating on things not quite being right, and it doesn't really bother you. But if you're an outsider, it's very hard sometimes to adjudicate between that. And so one of the pushbacks can be an anti-expert climate, which we see now. And I hope that Russell is right, that our current crisis, that one of the silver linings will in fact be a kind of renewal of appreciation and a renewal of understanding of expertise, of how to weigh it properly.
Thanks, Art. Okay, let me just read out that first question that's come in on Slido. That's the top question that's been upvoted. Why is there a need to find meaning, value, and purpose? What if those things simply do not exist? Maybe I'll let Art think through this and give an answer, since you were the one who spoke about meaning, value, and purpose, and science can't answer ultimate questions like this. What if, why is there a need for these, and what if they simply do not exist?
Well, so if you are a believer in scientism, then I think inevitably one of the consequences is that meaning and purpose and also these things do not exist, because those are fluffy, soft things you can't measure, and so they're just kind of epiphenomena of something. Maybe there's some kind of chemical reaction in your body that releases endorphins and makes you feel good, but they're largely meaningless. And I think it's important on the first side to realize that scientism fundamentally leads to something of this nature. And we've did this in this film that I put up very briefly, Why Are We Here? You'll see that we interview a number of philosophers, but particularly a philosopher called Alex Rosenberg, who is an atheist in scientism, and he's got a very good book where he basically points out that if you believe there's nothing but atoms and molecules, then you really should believe that meaning and purpose and all these kinds of things are not true. The issue, of course, with that is that I don't really think any of us can live our lives that way. So you may say, well, why do we need meaning and purpose? But inevitably, you have it. Even Alex Rosenberg, clearly, when you speak to them, has a strong sense of meaning and purpose. He just somehow, part of his meaning and purpose is to try to tell people that there is no meaning and purpose. He feels it very strongly. He has that kind of evangelistic zeal for it. And so I think we cannot really live lives without meaning. I don't quite know what the right word to say. It's just kind of a meaningless statement. We may look for meaning in different places, or we may desire for it, but we need it because it allows us to decide how to live or how not to live. Without it, I think there's really no reason to be alive. It turns into kind of nihilism, which in practice doesn't really work.
Thanks, Art. Russell or Bob, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, I can chime in. I mean, I think even at a first level, there are pragmatic reasons for why we want to have ways of working out meaning, value, and purpose. I mean, if you want to build a reasonable life, I've talked very effectively about choosing a wife and how different that is from the scientific method. And I think, we, all of us, regardless of our philosophical outlook, want lives with good relationships in them. We want to know how to bring up our children, all of those sorts of things. And science, although it gives some pointers in some places, we begin in the lab to build good relationships or to define a set of values about which to build a family. So I think it just gives us a better life if we have an understanding of meaning, value, and purpose. And I think even the non-Christian world has understood this. I mean, within I do a lot of technology transfer, so I run companies and things like that. And in the business world, there's a concept of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which comes from sort of psychology as applied to human resources. And it basically says, what does a business have to do to keep its people happy? And at the very bottom of that hierarchy of needs, you've got to pay them enough so they can buy groceries and not be hungry during the day. But once you've established that, which for most of us, that happens quite quickly, there are then higher needs where we want to feel part of something more worthwhile. We don't want to think we spend our limited time on Earth just converting oxygen to carbon dioxide and nothing else. So I think instinctively everybody knows that a life without meaning, value, and purpose is just really not worth having.
A follow-up question. Okay, so science, yes, doesn't explain meaning, beauty, purpose. There's a cluster of questions along these lines. So if we say, well, religion or faith or Christianity is one source of explanation for this, are there others? Why should Christianity be the only source of this? Why not philosophy, as it were? Philosophy is concerned about meaning, purpose, beauty, order as well. So I guess the questions of this nature are asking what makes Christianity unique. Anyone wants to tackle that?
Well, maybe I should talk. One of the unique things about Christianity is that it's so solidly embedded in the material world. The very first chapter of the very first book of the Bible, Genesis 1, it talks about how God made things, and every day he'd made something, he sat down and said, that was good, that was good, that was good, that was good, 6 times over. Then on the last day, he saw everything he'd made, including humans, and he said, that was very good. Now, whatever else you think of Genesis 1, you can't get away from the fact that we are embedded in a material world. And we're not people unless we're body and spirit together. We're not disembodied spirits moving around. We're embodied people. So I often say to people, just to stir them up a bit, that Christianity is a very materialistic religion. It's very embedded in the material world. And actually, that's why I think it's great that to be a scientist studying that material world, it just fits in so well with Christianity. So I think that is, I think it may even be a unique aspect of faiths. Christianity may be unique in its emphasis on this material world. And, the very first commandment we were given in Genesis 1:28 was to have dominion over this material world, to look after it in the way God would have looked after it. And actually a lot of our woes today are because we haven't done that. We've said, I want to use it for my own selfish ends, not for the good of humankind. So I think there is something very special about Christianity. If I can speak personally, it's just that every year that's gone by since I became a Christian, about the same time as in my life as Russell, when I came up to university, everything I've learned just makes more and more sense year by year. I just understand it better year by year. And I think that's very encouraging. I mean, Christianity just, to me, explains the way I am, the way I behave, the way other people behave, the way the world is, better than anything else I've ever come across. So that's just my personal testimony. But the bottom line is, material Christianity is embedded in a material world. That, and in the new creation, God is not going to make all new things. He's going to make all things new again. He's going to come back into this world and make it the way it was meant to be.
I think that's super helpful. I want to concur with all the words that Bob said. And just to one of the questions that you gave was, doesn't philosophy cover these things? And the answer is yes, indeed it does. And many great philosophers have been Christians. Even many great current philosophers are Christians, and Christians benefit a lot from philosophy. It helps a lot to understand, epistemology. How do you obtain knowledge about the world? Ontology. What is the world like? A whole series of things are super helpful, and philosophy helps us sharpen our ideas about them, understand them. I find philosophy very interesting. I'm kind of an amateur philosopher. I spend a lot of time reading the literature, and I think it helps my Christian faith. It helps me understand another part of the world better. And one of the things that we pushed on a little bit on our movie was the idea that there are non-material realities. An example for many people would be mathematics. So mathematical truths like 1 + 1 is equal to 2, or etc., are e to the I theta is sine theta plus I cos theta plus I sine theta, Euler's equation. Those kinds of concepts are true, regardless of whether they have physical instantiation. They don't live somewhere behind the moon. These are non-material realities which exist. That's a philosophical concept. It's not religious at all, but it helps you realize that there might be other non-material truths in the world, like moral truths or others, and that these and that when we're in our Christian searching, we are searching for these spiritual truths. And so what it does, it opens you up to the possibility that there could be something else besides just the material world out there. And then once that possibility is there, then you should look around and start asking yourself, well, what would that be like? What might that be like? And the Christian story is an extremely compelling one. And it fits in very closely with philosophical thinking and with our scientific thinking. These are fields that mesh very well with it, as it should. So if you have a religious kind of idea that is philosophically unsound, then there's something wrong with it. Okay, or if you have a religious set of ideas that are scientifically unsound and the science is provably true, then there's a serious problem. But Christianity isn't that way. Christianity links very closely to those things, but it also they give you something more. It gives you a bigger explanation of why the world is the way it is, and it's deeply intrinsically, it's intellectually satisfying. It's existentially satisfying, but also intellectually satisfying. And so I think the point of my talk, in some sense, was to point out that there are a whole bunch of things in this world that for which science is not the right way of adjudicating, or getting science is not the best way of getting reliable knowledge about those issues. Even those issues are super important, and we all need to adjudicate them. But for many of these, actually Christianity offers a kind of deeper way of thinking about them, which is super helpful. So I gave the concept of the intrinsic value of human beings, on which our ideas like human rights and others are based. And fundamentally, those concepts come from a Christian understanding of human being created in the image of God, and that's a deeply, profoundly Christian set of thoughts that has all kinds of philosophical, legal, and consequences for our world that are really important to keep to not lose.
In my own life, I came at this from the other end. So it wasn't that I was dissatisfied with the limits of science and therefore started looking for something else that would give meaning. I came completely from the other end. I was, to my used to the person of Jesus through the New Testament accounts, and I was deeply surprised by what I found. So for me, I find those things of meaning and value in Christianity because of the person of Jesus, that the scale of his claims are so enormous that he has to be unique. He is either God incarnate or he is nothing. What he can't be is one of many players of equal value. So I guess I never had to deal with a question about looking for value. Where do I find it? Because I was starting from the person of Jesus.
Okay. A related question, and again, any one of you can take this. closely related to meaning and purpose and value is the concept of morality. I think ethics and morality. So, is there anything in science that speaks to morality, or is it a total value-free area? So, what's the relationship that you found in your area of research? Is so human behavior, I suppose, societal and individual so morality is what I'm looking at. So can science answer questions or speak into questions of morality?
I mean, I'll be talking a bit more about this tomorrow. I'm a very applied scientist. So to my mind, science and technology go hand in hand. And I think, at least in my experience, questions of ethics and morality tend to be raised more from the technology side. So the science allows us to understand the world as it is. But then when we actually want to do something about that, we then have to act ethically and with morals. And so we have to start asking the questions at that point, once we begin to transfer the science into technology.
Perhaps I can just give an advert for my talk on Saturday when I'm talking about disasters. And just to give a spoiler alert, I think what I'm going to say is that most disasters we experience are not because of something intrinsically evil in the world. It's because of something intrinsically sinful, or if you like, evil, certainly selfish, in the way that humans behave and interact with that world. And almost every disaster, even the ones we called natural disasters, it can be traced to human agency, because these natural processes are what makes the world a good place. And you can even apply that to the COVID-19 crisis that we're in, the pandemic we're in now, because viruses are neutral of their own existence. In fact, they're quite useful for various things. A lot of animals co-opt them to kill bacteria. In fact, humans are co-opting them in the lab to build things they're co-opting viruses to kill some of these superbugs, which antibiotics can't touch nowadays, which are so scary. And humans actually even use a virus in the placenta in women, because the placenta is designed to block interaction between the mother and the fetus. But of course, you need to get nutrients through, and viruses are rather good at getting through cell walls. So we humans have co-opted viruses to do that job for us. So even this pandemic is due to something which intrinsically is neutral, if you like, being in the wrong place. And we could discuss, and now is not the time, why did it jump from animals, reservoirs, to humans? And there are various reasons. Why is it spreading around the world? Why can't we contain it when we know how to do that? So most natural processes are neutral. Now, having said that, there are some things that I think scientists should not do. I think there's a repugnance against cloning people, for example. And I think there is a case for Christians who are scientists to actually speak into the debate about things like modification of humans. What is good for medicine reasons and what is going too far, cloning people to be like yourself. So there are certainly ethical issues that scientists and Christians should speak into, which arise out of science. To what extent does artificial intelligence affect what's happening in the world? Whether it's in elections or even in whether to give you a credit card or not on your credit rating. These are being done by machines now. Is that a good thing? There are a lot of issues that are morally and ethically important that we should speak into, but the scientific issues themselves are not ethical, because of course ethics only exists in the sphere of human interaction. So there are important things that scientists and Christians should discuss, for sure.
A slightly different angle to that question about science and morality would be that the word morality is quite a slippery word, and you need to kind of distinguish different levels of it. So at the kind of most basic level, you could talk about capacities. So does an individual have a capacity to make a decision on certain types? Do they understand the differences, for example? And there we'd say, animals and humans clearly vary a lot in their capacities to make certain types of judgments. And then next level up might be kind of dispositions that we have, or instincts. So you have certain tendencies towards this or towards that. That can be morally important to understand, whether we have a tendency towards violence, for example, or a tendency towards love, or a tendency, all those kinds of instincts that we have. Think about something like cooperation, right? So humans have tendencies to cooperate. Doesn't make cooperation right or wrong, right? Cooperation can be both good. We cooperate for something good, but the greatest example of human cooperation is probably war, and we would not necessarily consider that to be good. So, but you can still study this cooperation. It's important, and it has an impact on our understanding of morality. And then we often use morality. We kind of mean something like ethics, what's right and what's wrong. So those are normative accounts, right? So we say, it's wrong to clone humans, or it's right to clone humans. Those are ethical questions where we have some kind of set of ethical principles, and then we try to apply it in practice. And then you have kind of meta-ethical questions, which is, what kind of ethics do you use? So do you believe that ethics comes from God in one or the other, or do you believe in some kind of utilitarian ethics, where ethics fundamentally about maximizing something like the common good or happiness? And so I just gave you 4 different levels of morality: these dispositions, normative accounts or ethics, and what you might call meta-ethics. And where science has real input is in the first 2. So science can be used to measure our capacities. It can be used to measure our dispositions. We could look at evolutionary descriptions of our past and see whether that has any kind of morally salient impact. But what it doesn't tell us is anything normative or ethical. It doesn't tell us if something is right or wrong. It just might tell us humans have a certain potential this way. We know, for example, a really simple example would be, we now know that certain people have genetic dispositions towards alcoholism. We know that because it runs in families. We also know that certain social conditions can make you more likely to fall into alcoholism. We would probably all say, on a normative basis, alcoholism is wrong. Okay, but science doesn't tell us that it's right or wrong. Science does tell us that it has all kinds of negative impacts on ourselves and our environments. So science is morally salient. It tells us things about morality. It helps us understand that alcoholism, for example, has a genetic component, which is one of the reasons why one of the treatments of alcoholics is to say, stop drinking and never touch it again. Because if you happen to have this disposition towards it, right, then you might be pulled into that much more easily than somebody else who doesn't have it. I was just with an alcoholic last week, and we were talking to him. He was wanting to start drinking a little bit. I said, just a little bit. We said, no, don't do it, because he clearly has some kind of very strong disposition towards it. And science has explained that to us and helped us. So it's important when we talk about morality that we don't just say that science can't say anything about morality. Science doesn't really say anything about ethics, but it does help us understand what our dispositions are, and that can reflect on how we treat people, how we think about people. It can affect on how we might ethically interpret a particular situation.
Thanks, Art. That's fascinating, because one of the things that immediately that raises in my mind, and some people have put that in the Slido questions as well, issues of science being used, or the research of science, or the findings of scientists on questions of things such as not just alcoholism, but sexual orientation, and that's a huge topic, I know, as well as the stuff that poor J.K. Rowling has gotten into over the past few months, cancel culture and all that, apparently based on science from one side or the other, gender construct and all that sort of stuff. So, I mean, how do you as scientists feel on this? I know, most of you are in the area of physics rather than biology, but do you have any comments on this? Science being used by one side or the other on issues of human behavior and morality in areas of sexuality and gender. Yeah.
Well, so I think I'm not going to comment a lot on the current hot topics, which are very very explosive. I don't think they're actually, if you start pushing a little bit on these kinds of arguments, there's a lot of internal inconsistencies going on. But I'll just give you one more example of where science affects something in our sexuality. So what science has shown is that for many animals, the males in particular are much more likely to be sexually unfaithful than the females, and this has certain evolutionary advantages. And it seems like this is true as well for humans in many societies. So males are more likely to sleep around than females are. Now, that's a super interesting fact. If it's true, it might very well be true. In practice, these things are often a lot harder to establish than it seems. So study A says it, but study, you got to be super careful. But let's just assume for the argument that this is in fact true, that males on average are more likely to be disposed towards more promiscuity. That doesn't tell us whether that's right or wrong. It just tells us that males have this disposition towards promiscuity, right? I mean, Dennis Alexander always gives the famous example of that he has one genetic test that can more or less will identify every single person in prison. And this genetic test is, of course, the Y chromosome, right? Because males are predominantly in prison. And so we know males are more prone to violence, etc., etc. That's partially socially, but possibly also partially just something in our biology that makes us that way. And so given that's the case, it's helpful that science tells us that we might have those kind of proclivities or those kinds of dispositions. The question about whether it's ethical or not, science has actually a lot less to say about. It's other questions tell us whether it's ethical or not to be promiscuous, whether tendency with violence is ethical or not. It's just different. It helps to say that if I have a bunch of males that I'm trying to raise, that I might worry more about their tendency towards violence than I would with a set of females. That's just on average that might be the case. Right? And if science tells me that is the case, or if they're more likely to be promiscuous, it helps me to realize that. That'll help me in raising them well if they're my kids, for example. But it doesn't tell me at all whether it's ethically right or wrong. And I think on these hotter topics of sexuality or transgender, etc., which are super sensitive and complicated topics, about which I think we're all nervous about even speaking without getting ourselves caught into something we don't want to get into. Fundamentally, these are often complex ethical questions, and unfortunately, the public conversation about them is unbelievably simplistic.
Thank you. That's super helpful. I'm sorry, and again, apologies for jumping on you with a question that's potentially taken the wrong way for if this goes out on the internet. Let me end. We are at 9:30 with I think a very interesting question. Maybe something practical, and this is from. I assume a student because of the setting of the question. As a behavior science student studying in university, my lecturers have brought up Bible verses and they make conclusions and they say that Christianity conflicts with science. What would be your advice for a student in a situation like this, an undergraduate or maybe a postgraduate student, where you face certain kinds of pressure from either your colleagues or your lecturers, your teachers? Any thoughts on that?
Do you want to kick in, Russell, or shall I?
Go on, you kick off.
Okay, let me just start off by saying that Christianity is a deeply countercultural religion. And you've mentioned one aspect of that, but there's many others, aren't there, to do with all kinds of issues that we face: honesty and truthfulness, and not fiddling your expenses, and paying your taxes when they're due, and all kinds of stuff like that. So there's nothing particularly different about the issue you raised than there are about those things. We are called to be countercultural for good reasons, and they are explained. But the other thing to say actually is that if you go into a city centre church in Cambridge, and I bet the same is true in Oxford, you'll find that 85% of the students there or more are science students. They're not doing the humanities. And I think there's a good reason for that. I think it's because scientists are studying, as I've said before, are studying the natural world. They're studying God's creation. And nothing you could find there actually could disprove God, actually. Whereas the humanities are generally, in some sense, looking at human behavior. And from a Christian perspective, humans are sinful. At least that's the theological viewpoint, but it's also the experience of each one of us, I'm sure, that we've rebelled against God. And And so actually, I kind of think that scientists are in a fortunate position, really, compared to the humanities, you know, living in a world where you're studying fallen human nature, if you like, or the consequences of it, a world of postmodernism where people say there is no meaning in anything, and when you read a text, it shouldn't be the author's intention that you try and read. You make of it what you make of it, depending on your circumstances. It's much more straightforward being a scientist, actually, is my view. If science lecturers are saying something like that in the classroom, I'd be astonished. I think Russell and I would both be fired from Cambridge University if we said something like that. Although, of course, I have students who are Christians, and if they come to me and they ask about Christian things, then of course I'll talk to them about the evidence for Christianity, which I think is on a par with the evidence for other scientific theories. You know, there's good evidence behind it. That's why I'm a Christian. But I'd be surprised if a lecturer is going to diss religion in any sense, actually, Christianity or any other one, actually. But Russell, over to you.
I was going to make 2 points. I mean, first, to recognise that if somebody's professor of science is saying science has disproved God or the Bible, then the student in question needs to recognise that that lecturer is going beyond science. You know, there isn't a scientific experiment that's been done that disproved the existence of God. So what that lecturer is doing is actually feeding his or her own philosophical worldview into science, and it's important to distinguish between the two. And if the student wants to be a good student, then he or she has a responsibility to absorb the bits of science that are being passed on, but to filter out the bits of extraneous worldview that are being passed. So just because a professor of science says it, you've got to really work out, are they saying it with the authority of science, or are they borrowing the authority of science to enhance their own philosophical position? And then very, very practically, I would say find a mentor, find an older Christian who has been through similar things, and just talk about these things. It can be very isolating being a young scientific student, because you're absorbing so many things, such a huge volume of things, new things to learn. And then just finding somebody a little older who's been through all of this and just chatting it over with them can be really helpful.
Thanks, Russell. I think that's really helpful. Anyone else wants to speak on this? If not, just kind of a last. I know I said that was last, but and we are beyond our time, so this is the real last question, or real kind of topic. There's a question about science and religion being described as non-overlapping magisteria. I think apparently that is language from, and I don't know whether Stephen Jay Gould is the one that came up with it, but you know, there's yeah. Do you have any thoughts on that? That different areas of inquiry, there's facts versus values, and in some ways, art's presentation, some of what you, all three of you have kind of said, well, science is limited to this, it shouldn't overreach. But I, you know, when I hear of this non-overlapping magisteria, I worry about the other aspect as well. Does religion overreach into science as well? I don't know if there's something that you might want to say about this. Is there this understanding that we have two different domains of knowledge and kind of different rules to play with in some ways, although there are some things which are similar? Is that a useful way of thinking through? Danger, of course, being that you end up with different silos, and do scientists who are Christians end up with split personalities? I don't know. I'm just thinking aloud about how one grapples with this. You know, there's one domain here, there's the other domain here. You can make claims here, but not there. But if you are working in both areas, how do you work this out? Yeah, I'm sorry. Does this make sense to you?
I guess I've changed my mind on this. I think 10 years ago, if you'd asked me about non-overlapping magisteria, I probably would have said, yeah, that's about right. I think in the last 10 years, I've come to realize that the problem with non-overlapping magisteria is it misses out a really interesting territory which lies at the intersection of those two domains of knowledge. So I think what's helpful about it is that it recognizes that science is not religion. The methodologies are different. They're asking different questions. So that is helpful. But the fact that they are non-overlapping, I think, means we miss out. Because at the intersection, so in my mind, I've got a Venn diagram with an overlap point in between. And at that intersection of where does science help religion and where does religion help science, there's some really interesting things to do. And I wouldn't want to miss out on those just because I think these two spheres of knowledge are completely separate and isolated. And at the end of the day, they're both describing the same world that we live in, and they're used by people who ultimately are seeking an integrated view. That tells
I'd say.
oh,
sorry.
No, please carry on, Bob. I've finished. Yeah.
You froze there. I thought you'd finished. I think it's just a cop-out to it was Stephen Jay Gould, and I think it was just a cop-out because he didn't want to even get into a domain of religious viewpoints. A very common metaphor which is used is that you can look at the world through the eye of faith. You can look at the world through the eye of science. And as Russell said, it's exactly the same world you're looking at. And it's just that binocular vision with two eyes is much better than looking through one eye only. It just gives you a much richer, much deeper view of it. So certainly that's a perspective that I've always felt. You are looking at the same world, and many of the techniques we use, we're looking for the truth behind what we can see, both in our religious faith and in science. So they're very similar, actually, in the methodologies in that sense. So I don't think the non-overlapping magister is a particularly helpful concept for much at all, actually. I'd rather say we're looking through binocular vision, looking through two eyes, if you like, at the world. And yes, Ard has just got out of the ski lift, I see. So maybe he wants to say something.
Yeah, so this is the last. I just realized that I caught the last lift down because it closes in 2 minutes. So luckily, my family just warned me that I better jump on, so I just did. Yes, I think Russell and Bob gave good answers to that question. I don't think what I was advocating at all would be non-overlapping magisteria. I actually, in Venn diagrams, I like to draw the following Venn diagram. A very large Venn diagram is my faith, and inside of it is a smaller a smaller circle, which would be science. So science fits into a bigger picture of way of understanding the world. And inside that circle of science, I've got very specific ways of trying to obtain reliable knowledge that are very valuable, and sometimes help me understand my religious faith in certain ways, or help me understand. So I gave an example earlier of dispositions that we might have. Well, understanding those dispositions, their biological origins, for example, can be very helpful for me in my own personal walk with God. It helps me understand where my weaknesses might be. So there are definitely ways in which science and faith can interact, and I think it's helpful to say, look, these things are non-overlapping. If you're trying as a first order to get somebody who thinks that science explains everything to move one step to the right, to the left, but it misses out, as Russell points out, on a very rich set of interactions that are really fun to look at, or the bits that are the most interesting about this whole science-religion science-religion debate, as it were.
Well, thank you. All that remains for me to say, I think right now, is to thank our distinguished guests, and hopefully we can call them now our friends, because we have interacted with them for just short of an hour. I have been richly enriched, listening to the talk, as well as the interactions with Russell, with Ard, with Bob. At the very least, what I've learned is the source of that phrase, thinking God's thoughts after him. Now I know it's from Johannes Kepler. I actually heard this as a description for theology from the recently late J.I. Packer when I was studying under him that I thought it came from him, which I thought was just interesting because he described theology as thinking thoughts, God's thoughts after him. And I'm always intrigued about how both scientists as well as churchmen in the past, physicists have been interested in metaphysics, and theologians have been doing works of science in the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th centuries. And it looks like today there's fewer examples of this, but I'm glad that we have people from Faraday Institute coming to talk to us about that. So wonderful. Thank you so much for your time with us this evening. Art, thank you for taking time off your wonderful holiday. I'm so jealous of where you are. You have shown us that surely, my daughter was telling me, she's watching this, that you've proved that Chinese tourists indeed are everywhere, because I think there was a group behind you. Just when you were speaking on I can't remember what it was. So thank you so much. For those of you who want to join us for the rest of the conference, you can still sign up. If I could put up the slide again. So this is the end of our discussion this evening. You can still sign up for the conference. Please do so. Tomorrow evening, we'll hear from Russell on nanotech, particularly about how the application of science into technology can have implications and interactions with questions of ethics and morality. So that will be tomorrow evening here in Singapore time. And then we'll hear about Christian origins or human origins on Wednesday. And then on Thursday, we have a talk from Bob White on science, natural disasters, evil, and we'll end with, again, Bob giving us a survey on how Christian faith has influenced scientists. You will notice, of course, that our topics are circling around a few different ideas to do with the interface between science and faith, particularly Christian faith. It will be especially useful, I think, for people who are working in science, who are studying in science, as well as churchmen, pastors, theologians. I think this is all useful for us to learn kind of at the interface of our domains of knowledge with science. I'm sorry I was not able to answer or raise all the questions that were posted on Slido. I will be collecting them all, and tonight, when I take a closer look at them, I will distribute them to the particular professors who I think are best placed to answer the kind of questions that you asked. And again, my apologies for overrunning by 20 minutes. But do join us tomorrow. That's all I have. That's all that BGST has, Faraday Institute has for this evening. This production, as it were, was brought to you by BGST, Faraday Institute in Cambridge, as well as the Fellowship of Evangelical Students, FES, at the universities that are in Singapore. The feedback QR code is, you can see it now on your screen. We would be very thankful if you can tell us your feedback on the session that you've just experienced, and we hope to do better the next time we organize something like this. So do join us tomorrow evening if you can and if you want to. Professor Russell Crowburn is speaking. So thank you. Good night, everyone. Thanks, profs. Thank you so much. We'll catch up with you.